Hello, universe. How are you today? I want to talk about a very delicate and potentially dangerous activity that's going on right now that is politically motivated and definitely race motivated, and my concerns around it. Now, if you are not a citizen of the United States or don't watch television, as I've said before, then you may not know of this story. But some time back there was a man by the name of George Zimmerman who was a community watch participant who had an interaction, an altercation with a young man by the name of Trayvon Martin. And during this fight that occurred between them, George Zimmerman pulled a gun and shot Trayvon Martin. Now, the two things that are key about this is, number one, these two men were of alternate ethnicities. George Zimmerman is now what's known as, is under what is the new qualification as a white Mexican or white Latino, and Trayvon Martin happened to be a African American and Black American. So as a result of this, a huge thing has occurred, especially in the media, that has been basically calling for George Zimmerman's head. Now, understand that the whole story behind this is that Trayvon Martin was in a neighborhood that he was not a resident of, and that's not against the law. It can be wherever he wants to be, but this neighborhood where he was had also been having issues with crime, and so they had a community watch going on, and George Zimmerman happened to be one of the participants in the community watch. He saw Trayvon Martin and approached him apparently about sort of finding out who he was and what he was doing in their neighborhood, because he was trying to create safety. That was part of his job, was to take watch of the community and try and keep it safe as much as possible. He wasn't a police officer, he was part of a community group that had organized to do this. Well, somehow they became engaged. Some people say that George Martin started roughing up Trayvon Martin. Other people say Trayvon Martin didn't want to talk to him or engage with him, and he started an altercation and started sort of talking back and, pushing on him or whatever. So there's so many different variations. It's he said, she said, he said, he said, he said, he said. So Trayvon Martin ultimately was killed, and then became the dubious task of figuring out if George Zimmerman acted wrongfully in shooting Trayvon Martin. There is a law in the United States known as Stand Your Ground that says if you feel you are in imminent danger, you have the right to protect yourself. It's basically like imminent danger. So, I'm holding my phone to try and keep this short. So, that became the real question. Now, when it first was being considered by the prosecution as to whether or not George Zimmerman should be put to trial or go to trial on the charges of murder the evidence did not suggest that he should go to trial. They thought that he was acting in self-defense because it was, once again, he said, there was no major eyewitnesses to say, there were no eyewitnesses to say how they became engaged in a battle. But there were people who say that George Zimmerman was on top, and people who say Trayvon Martin was on top. And because the evidence didn't support, there was not enough evidence to support Trayvon or George Zimmerman being guilty of murder instead of just stand your ground and self-defense, he was going to be the charges were not going to be filed against him necessarily for in insignificant evidence. Well, this is when the President of the United States, our President of this year, 2013, our current President, Barack Obama, sent some of his representatives down to Florida to encourage the indictment of George Zimmerman, which ultimately occurred. He was indicted and he went to trial. Now, there was a lot of media hype in and around this whole trial thing, and more tense even, believe it or not, in my opinion, than it was during the times of the OJ trial, which occurred about 20 years ago. But that trial is significant, and we'll talk about it in a few minutes, but a lot of media press around it, and ultimately, when the verdict, the selection of the jury was handed the trial after everybody, the prosecution and defense had made their arguments, and the jury was handed the responsibility of making a judgment. They had gone from murder to also being offered the option to actually do manslaughter, because there was the evidence that the prosecution would throw out there in a lot of ways actually supported the defense's position, and that's just reality. I'm not picking sides. You can go look at it and see how a lot of the things that the prosecution were suggesting ultimately ended up supporting the defense's argument in the whole trial. So anyway, as a result of it, when the jury got the case to make a verdict, they asked, I'm aware of one question that they had asked the judge, which was, what is the definition of manslaughter? What is manslaughter? And the judge came back and said that they needed to ask a more specific question. Now, that's a point of debate for me, because, asking a judge what is the definition of manslaughter under the eyes of the law is a specific question, And they're asking because they want to make sure that if they're going to consider putting George Zimmerman in prison, not just for murder, or for manslaughter, or to acquit him, then they need to know the definitions of those particular things, not just dead is dead or killed is killed, accident's an accident. They need to know these things so they can decide how it fell underneath it. They could have called it involuntary manslaughter. You know what I mean? For example, it could have been like he descended himself and it was involuntary manslaughter as a result of it because it just occurred. So I'm saying wasn't saying it was considered involuntary manslaughter. They just said, "What is manslaughter?" And the judge did not give them an answer. So ultimately, the jury, selected by both prosecution and defense, chose to acquit George Zimmerman. So what's happened is there's been a huge fallout as a result of it. Now, one of the things I want to talk about most importantly, and I'm going to try and get this brief, I promise I try so hard, sometimes I get too long, but the first thing I want to talk about is President Obama getting involved in this case in any kind of capacity. Aside from the fact that he sent his representatives down, some of his representatives down, to encourage, and every office of the United States represents the president. Okay, but he did have actual participation in sending people to go and encourage this indictment. Well, President Obama, in addition to that, also made a comment where he said that if Trayvon Martin if he had a son, then it would have looked like Trayvon Martin. President Obama should not have been involved in this, and I think it's very clear if you really think about it. The reason is because in his entire 8 years, when there has been black on white crime or black on Latino crime, he's never been involved. And when there's been more obvious evidence in those situations, he's never gotten involved. And as a result of it, by him getting involved in this situation, it creates a situation where he is showing his personal discrimination. he may not necessarily be that way. I'm not saying that he is, but it suggests it, and it indicates a personal issue with people who are of white or Latino ethnicity, when someone who is black is killed. But he has once again not been involved in any other cases that involved black on white or black on Latino crime. As a result of that, he's going to make a lot of enemies, and as a matter of fact, I think the political repercussions of it are even worse, which is going to say that it's going to be more difficult, increasingly difficult, for someone who happens to be black, who may be a very qualified candidate for president, to ever get in. Because he's created a precedent now where, even though people shouldn't do it, it's just like with the people judging George Zimmerman without knowing all of the facts of his case and being in that trial and being in that courtroom. People are going to make judgments based on the fact that he got involved in something, and he continues to be involved in some capacity. He's distanced himself after the verdict came in, but it was a little too late because he got in and said these things, and it makes for an imbalance and a certain amount of irritation and disillusionment with trying to make a right choice on president, when you feel like if you let someone else in who might be black, that they will stand more for their ethnicity than for the people of ethnicity, the people of all ethnicities. And that's very dangerous. Now, has George Bush and, Bill Clinton and all these people, have they done things that have been race motivated or ethnicity motivated towards whites? Not that we're really, terribly aware of from